Okay, so I'm going to illustrate how I cast one of these phone stands, but let's start with the finished product. This is one that's come out of the mold. It hasn't been cleaned up or finished off yet. It is in, quote, granite, which is a composition of different stone and epoxy. It started out as a 3D design, which was used to print this master or buck. This is an ABS plastic which has been fumed with acetone to make it nice and smooth. That was then inserted or glued onto some cardboard. A 3D printed support or mold support was created. That went down over the top. Silicone was poured in here to create a silicone mold, which is this pink mold. And the silicone mold and the mold holder is what we'll use to do the casting. So let's put these other things aside. Before we cast, let's look at the materials we're going to be using. In addition to the mold, we have the mix of crushed stone. We'll also be using a few flakes of gold mica in that. We have the epoxy. This is Clearcast 7000, which is a very slow setting casting epoxy, very clear, very nice stuff. We have some mold release. This is really just mineral oil in a little atomizer. Silicone epoxy don't stick together too much, don't need much in the way of mold release, but I think a little bit's a good idea to preserve the mold. Then we have a digital scale to measure things carefully, and a large paper bowl. Styrofoam is a little cheaper, but tends to crack. A couple of mixing cups, a bigger one for the stone, smaller one for the epoxy. The smooth plastic helps you get all of your epoxy out. Some craft sticks or popsicle sticks. A couple of them had the ends clipped off so that they're nice and square. I have a glove out. You're not going to see me wearing gloves in this. Most manufacturers will tell you to wear gloves with epoxy. I find that I don't really get it on my fingers doing this. Hopefully I won't in this demonstration video. And I do clean them with hand cleaner and wash them immediately after. Paper towels always come in handy, and having a trash can that you can reach immediately is also very useful to keep the sticky epoxy out of things. Alright, so the first thing is to prepare the mold and mold form. Let's put just a little bit of this mineral oil. I'm going to do it to the side here so I don't get it all over the place. This is actually baby oil, which turns out to be 3 times cheaper at my local pharmacy than mineral oil, even though it's mineral oil with a little fragrance added. I'm going to squirt just maybe 1 squirt here into the mold. I really don't want very much into this clean mold. Squirt and a half. So everything here is going to smell faintly of freshly greased babies, but I guess that's not the worst smell in the world. I'm going to go ahead and rub it in. We want it all down in the nooks and crannies, and you can see this mold has some very sharp edges, some deep folds. If you happen to be a proctologist, this may be very familiar sort of feel here. Don't want it to pool. Don't want noticeable drops of it. In fact, I'm just going to make sure that I don't have any extra, but just enough to get it a little bit coated, so that we don't have any sticking. To say this mold has been working well. I made the mold form a little too close to the buck, so some of the spots on this, especially down in here, are almost paper thin. So it's always a bit scary, but so far I've cast about 5 of these and no problems. The mold goes into the mold form, so make sure that's down in there good and snug. I take a good close look at it to make sure there's nothing in there that shouldn't be in there, because every little speck will show up in the final product. Make sure that's formed in the bottom. Okay, so the mold's all ready. Now it's a matter of preparing the ingredients. Slippery hands are not the best thing to be working with, so we'll do something about that. Start with the composite stone mixture, which I have pre-mixed in here. Actually, before we'll get that out, the one part that I might otherwise forget is to sprinkle a little gold mica into this lightly greased form. Just need a tiny pinch, and just put a few flakes. I might need a little bit more, sort of a streak or group. Gives a little grain or variety to the surface of this, which might otherwise be too uniform to really look natural. And most granite you see has a few brown or gold flakes in it. Alright, that should be sufficient. Alright, so the next thing is to weigh out our stone mixture. So we'll turn on the scale, zero this out. I'm doing this in grams, and this takes 350 grams of the stone mixture. Which works out in the finished product to just under a pound. So it's a nice hefty piece to hold your phone stable. Definitely does not feel like something made of plastic. $3.49. There's 350. Okay. So that's that mixture. Now the next item is the epoxy. The clear cup is not really necessary. It kind of lets you see if you're forming bubbles or what's going on. And like I said, the hard plastic, smooth plastic, makes things a little easier to fully empty out. So this particular project takes 80 grams of epoxy. This is two-part epoxy, equal measure. So we'll just do it by weight, and that makes 40 grams of each. It's not a bad idea to put a paper towel over your scale, especially if it's your kitchen scale as well, to keep it nice and clean. I'll try to be careful this time. $38. Another little glob should get us there. Alright, that's 40. Go ahead and recap that, and I'm just going to go ahead and mix the other part in to bring it up to 80. A bit risky because if you overdo it, there's really no going back, or you could add a little more of the other part. Safer way would be to measure them out individually and then mix them together. As long as we start at a reasonable pace and finish slow, we should be fine. $70. All right. 80. All right, cap that up, all nice and clean. Okay, so here's our, you can see how clear this epoxy is. I'm going to use one of the flat-edged craft sticks to stir. And mixing epoxy is just a matter of mixing it until you are completely convinced it's thoroughly mixed, and then mix it some more, and then mix it some more. Make sure the sides are all scraped down. This is pretty thin epoxy. It mixes pretty easily. They tell you to do this for several minutes. I'm not going to be doing this for several minutes, but I am going to completely thoroughly mix this stuff. Now this is advertised as a 24-hour setting epoxy, so you have lots of time to work with it. There's no reason to be in any hurry about this project. I find that it sets much faster than that, but I'm working in an uncooled garage in the summer in Florida, so it's plenty warm in here and plenty humid, and that certainly can affect cure time on epoxies. I can probably unmold this after as short as 4 hours. I don't know that I'd try it. 6 is probably safer. Again, given the conditions, it's better to do one of these in the morning and then unmold it at night, or vice versa, so that's closer to 12. but I'm getting a good solid cure after 6 hours. So this should be fairly well mixed. There are some small bubbles in it. Certainly they're smaller than the grains of stone and sand that I have here, so that's not going to be a problem. If you were making clear jewelry or something, you'd probably want to degas this. But they might come out as slow as this stuff cures. It's great stuff to work with. Really no odor. I can't detect an odor. So quite pleasant compared to others, especially fast setting epoxies. Alright, we'll go ahead and mix this in with our stone. This is pretty much like baking in the sense you got to get all the lumps out. Not like pancake batter where lumps are okay. The problem here is we have a mixture of coarser sand-like particles and extremely fine crushed marble, which is more like a wheat flour consistency. And the marble is a little harder to wet with the epoxy. It wants to stick through static electricity probably to all kinds of stuff. And also in liquid epoxy has a real tendency to float to the top. I don't think it's actually floating, but the mixing is pushing the finer particles up. And there's some interesting physics articles on how that happens. The upshot here is this needs to be mixed very thoroughly to be successful. Given the slow set time, there's absolutely no reason to be in any hurry whatsoever. Alright, I'm just about done mixing at this point. You can see the consistency is, I would say, sort of commercial, regular Jiffy type peanut butter. Little bit of flow to it, but still wants to clump together. I guess sort of like a real wet beach sand. That's important because you need enough flow to get down into the finer details of the mold. On the other hand, if you mix in too much, you're going to end up separating out the marble. Here's an early test casting with a number of issues, but a very severe case where the marble has floated to the top. It was molded like this, and you know, obviously we don't want to have that result. So the exact ratios for this particular mix are really extremely important to keep that from happening. This is the, after trial and error, the least amount of epoxy to get the job done, which also saves on cost because the epoxy is much more expensive than the stone and gives you a more natural look to minimize the epoxy. All right, we're ready to go into the mold. Again, no reason to be in any hurry. We'll just drop some in there. Try to drop it on the spots where the mic are so that stays in place instead of swishing it all around. What's going to be very important is pushing this down into the fine cracks and hard to reach areas. Definitely can have, I don't know if they're bubbles or just voids in some of the sharp bends and narrow spots in this. I've had some of those occur. It is possible to patch this up after the fact, but it's a lot of work. Once the epoxy is set and you pull it from the mold, you can put a fresh mixture into some of those holes, and then it hardens, and then you have to grind it down, and you're going to end up using basically sand embedded in a resin to try to ground down basically sand embedded in a resin. So it's definitely a lot of work. It's much better to get it right in the first place. I'm going to go ahead and poke some of this in there now that I've covered most of the mica. So I'm just using the rounded tip, and I think it's important to use the round one here if you don't want to damage your mold, your silicone, to go ahead and sort of force it down, make sure any air is released. Again, there's not really a lot of bubbling problem with this stuff. It's mostly a matter of settling the stone down into the tight spots. Got a couple more areas to tap it into. I'm going to go around and sort of repeat this process of adding it in bit by bit and forcing it down in and just working it. Okay, we're down to the last bit here, and you'll have, with those measurements and this mold, just enough to get the job done. With a tiny bit left over, which again, if you need to making more than one like I am and you need to patch a few open spots in an earlier casting, you can use for that. And I'm going to be taking this all the way up to the very rim and just keep working it in. Once it gets right to the rim, you can't go as forcefully so it doesn't splash out, but you want to pull out any voids. Needless to say, you want to be doing this on a level surface. It doesn't have to be absolutely perfectly level, but eyeballing it, it should settle to a nice level state. And I've used virtually all of it, and we're right at the rim. So I'm just going to do a couple things to finish up here. One is to take a stick and just sort of screed it off like I'm laying concrete, very gently. Make sure it's level. This gives you a nice level bottom and also helps to clean off any you may have gotten on the top of the mold, which is important if you plan to reuse the mold. Alright, that's looking pretty good. Alright, the last thing, which I'm not sure is absolutely necessary, but it feels good, is to tap this a little bit, again like you're vibrating concrete. The thing is, you don't want to overdo it, because once again, if you agitate those particles, the marble dust will float to the top, be forced to the top, maybe is more accurate, and you won't get a good result. So I'm just going to give it a good hard tap on the table about 6 times. And I don't know if you'll be able to see in the video, but I will be able to see a change in the surface. That's probably about all I'm going to risk. The surface has gotten a little bit lighter in color. To some degree that's just epoxy, but I think it also brings up a slight bit of the marble dust. But hopefully that settles it down in the mold. Rotating it just slightly to make sure it's flowing, kind of finishing off nice and level. And that's it. Throw away the stuff we've used up. Surface has stayed pretty clean here. I don't really feel any on my fingers. Having that little bit of mineral oil on there probably helps. And we'll come back in 12 hours and pull this thing out of here. Okay, we're going to unmold one of these castings and see what we've got. This one's been in the mold for 12 hours. 6 certainly would have been fully adequate. The first thing we're going to do is loosen it from this side. It's going to come right out of there. So we're pulling the mold and the casting out of the mold holder, nice and gentle on this thin. So this silicone I'm using is aluminite number 3, which is a very soft, I think about a 30 durometer. The casting has some undercuts. I'm just going to peel this away, but they're pretty gentle, so this peels off quite easily. And it's worked out really well for this project. All right, I'm just going to put it upside down here on the table, upside down to the casting process, but this is how it's going to look in reality. Very gently, some very thin spots in this mold. Release this. Again, this had an extremely thin coating of mineral oil as a mold release. There we go. First impression, she looks pretty good. There's a couple small pores here and there. One there, that will definitely use a little patching, but this is going to be rounded down some as well. Nice and smooth. Bottom, of course, needs a little trim where the edge of the piece was against the mold. But in general, I'd say this is a pretty average result that I'm getting from this. Just going to need a tiny bit of finishing. Otherwise, looks really good. Feels nice in the hand. And after it cures for another 24 hours, I think we'll be ready to finish this one up. I've got a new one in the mold setting up and have just a little bit of material left. The one I illustrated earlier being pulled out of the mold has a few small spots that need a little bit of patching. So while I have some wet mix left, and I'm going to go ahead and use my fingertip, even though people say not to get epoxy on your skin. Just try to get a few little particles in each one. I don't think it's really necessary to fill them completely. You just don't want it to look like there is a void there that has been completely left unignored. It's probably better to go too little than too much, because again, you're going to have to grind all this down once it's fully set. I've tried toothpicks, I've tried craft sticks, and frankly, fingers seem to work best. Certainly don't want to leave any blobs attached. You may find that there's some material left in here that's a little bit wetter, and that of course will go in the voids easier. Now I've got one spot here that has chipped off, so I want to fill it in so we can even it out later once it's fully cured. Again, this is the thinnest part of the whole project and probably pushed it a little too far on the thinness. We will round that off significantly when finishing. What's left? There's one here. Tiny little ones along the bottom I usually don't worry about. It's mostly the surfaces that are really obvious and the edges that are going to come into contact with anything or be at risk of chipping that I try to hit. I think we're good. Maybe one little dab up here. Back to that first one. So you can see there's actually very little additional material added to this. And some of that will knock off pretty quick. The very big, flat, smooth areas, especially down in this pocket, I recommend not trying to do anything with, because they're very hard to reach, and they should be very close to good to start with. Alright, so after that has cured for at least 12 hours, it's ready for the sanding and finishing process. Promptly clean your fingers off with some good hand cleaner. I find paint thinner also works on uncured epoxy, followed by soap and water. Okay, I'm going to talk a little bit about finishing these up. This is not the one I cast in the other video segments, but it's virtually identical. Maybe slightly better shape, but they're both pretty good. This doesn't need anything really patched on it, but there's some sharp edges that definitely could be rounded down a little bit. So I'm just going to go over some of the basic techniques. I'm not going to go through the whole process in the video. A few things are more boring than watching someone sand something. So what can we use? Well, this is a Dremel tool with a stone sanding bit mounted in it. This works well on the sharp edges. I have it set way down to a slow speed. You can tell by the sound. This is full speed. Keeping things nice and slow keeps you from going too far, keeps them from overheating the epoxy, and there's just no reason to go all commando on these things. It doesn't really need that much work. For the coarser sanding, this is some 80 grit. It's just a piece of an old sanding disc that I'm using, but It's a fairly coarse 80 grit mounted in a very sturdy fabric backing, which works well with the hard stone. So that can be used on some of the spots that really need some rough work. Along here is good. You can even use a chisel to cut some of this flashing from the mold off. But of course it would ruin a decent chisel, so don't use a good one. This is a medium for this. This is, well, actually I thought it was 150, but it's 220. 150 would probably be a better choice. Normal aluminum oxide paper like this is not going to work great because it's just not stiff enough. I mean, it's not tough enough really for the task, but that's what you got, that's what you got. To finish things up, this is, I think, 220 wet dry emery. So you got a little water, get things nice and wet. It will definitely give you a nice smooth finish on the stone. Generally, I would suggest a nice, slow, careful work on these sharp edges with the Dremel tool. Any rough components, or if you had to patch, you need to smooth that down. Something like this 80 or an 80 emery cloth, something a really tough paper. Take those down, and then finish off with around a 200 wet dry. Should give you enough of a finish that you are ready for a top coat. What I'm using on a top coat for these, if I can find it, is this stuff, Valspar Satin. I really like this stuff. I'm not exactly sure what the chemical formulation is, if it's a urethane or what, but this goes on really quick. It dries really quick. You can give it a second coat really quick, and the satin gives a nice coat to these without being overly glossy. So this is great stuff to use to finish these off with. What we're aiming for when we're finished is a nice comfortable finish without any sharp edges. You have to keep in mind that people in this case are going to be putting their phones in here, and you don't want any of this to scratch your phone. So these areas around this oval are really important to round off and get nice and smooth. This edge here is the sharpest one on the whole thing. I probably should have chamfered that a little more in the 3D design, but that can be rounded over and maybe a little bit back here. The rest of it is just a matter of how it feels in the hand. Once this has been sanded down, had a couple of coats of top treatment put on it, the last thing is just to glue some sort of non-stick base on the bottom, and I have some thin neoprene rubber that will be going on the bottom of these, and it's all done. All right, having done the Dremel tool and the coarse sanding with the 80 grit, I'm ready for the final sanding. And I was in here before when I called it 200 or 220 wet dry. This is actually 600 grit wet dry emery cloth. So if you haven't used this before, plenty of water is a good idea. I've got a bowl here. Don't be shy about getting the paper wet or getting the stone wet. Obviously you're going to make a little bit of a mess. And then otherwise, it's pretty much a matter of using it like normal sandpaper. So in the earlier sanding, I basically hit those curves really good, make them nice and round over around this oval. And just any other spots that didn't feel quite smooth. It was only about, I would say, 10 minutes worth of sanding. Unless you have major voids, they really shouldn't need a lot on this. You're probably going to want to stop and rinse this off once or twice while you're doing it, because with the water, the dust will make everything a little bit cloudy. And like anything else, you're going to put a top coat or paint on. If you can see it, it will show after the finish is on there. It's not going to hide anything. So you want to remove all visible scratches, sanding marks, etc. The large flat areas, unless there's a visible flaw, should need very, very little in the way of sanding. Less is probably better. Once this is all finished, I got a few more minutes of work to do here. You're going to want to rinse it off really good, make sure you get all the dust out of there, and then dry it, let it dry. And make sure it's completely dry, free of any lint or dust or anything, and then you're ready for your final coat.